The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It started with a ridiculous $50 fine, a petty power play by a woman whose entitlement knew no bounds. What she didn't know was that I had inherited something far more valuable than the house itself, something that would turn her perfectly manicured world upside down. Let me tell you, you won't see this ending coming, and it's a story of how a quiet man, pushed too far, can bring an entire empire crashing down with nothing but truth and a meticulously assembled legal file. My name is Arthur Vance, and until a few months ago, my life had been a whirlwind of high-stakes corporate litigation. For 30 years, I'd navigated the treacherous waters of mergers and acquisitions, unearthing buried clauses and leveraging obscure statutes to win multi-billion-dollar deals. But the relentless grind had taken its toll. The late nights, the constant travel, the moral compromises, they had slowly chipped away at me. Then, Eleanor, my wife, my anchor, my brilliant, beautiful Eleanor, passed away. The world just stopped. The vibrant colors of my life faded to a dull gray. The fight went out of me. So, I walked away from it all, leaving behind the corner office, the power suits, and the suffocating pressure of a life I no longer recognized. I came home, to the only place that felt like sanctuary. This place was more than just a house, it was the Vance family estate, a sprawling property nestled on the serene shores of Lake Serenity, a body of water that had been the backdrop to generations of my family's lives. My grandfather, a man of quiet wisdom and unshakable principle, had built this house, piece by painstaking piece, with his own hands. He taught me to fish in these very waters, to understand the subtle language of the wind across its surface, to find peace in its profound stillness. He had instilled in me a deep reverence for nature, and an even deeper respect for justice. After Eleanor's passing, the lake became my solace, my retreat, a liquid mirror reflecting not just the sky, but the quiet grief that still lived within me. Eleanor had loved to paint the lake, capturing its shifting moods in watercolors that now hung on my walls, silent testaments to her enduring spirit. Fishing here, alone with my thoughts, was the closest I came to feeling her presence, a thin thread of connection across the chasm of loss. The value of this place to me was immeasurable, utterly beyond any monetary appraisal. It was my legacy, my refuge, my last tangible link to the people who had shaped me. The Tranquility, however, was about to be shattered by a force of nature far less pleasant than a summer storm. Her name was Deborah Sterling, though everyone in the community knew her as Debbie. And everyone knew her as Madam President. She was the self-appointed, self-important monarch of the Grandview Heights Homeowners Association. Debbie was a caricature of entitlement, from her perfectly coiffed blonde bob, which I secretly called the universal "I want to speak to the manager" haircut, to her perpetually pursed lips that seemed designed solely for delivering pronouncements. She wore designer leisurewear that clung to her with an air of expensive desperation, and she drove a gleaming white luxury SUV that she handled with the aggressive confidence of a tank commander. Her eyes, usually narrowed with suspicion, seemed to bore into you, assessing your worth, your compliance, your potential as an obedient subject in her meticulously controlled kingdom. She viewed herself not as a servant of the community, but as its benevolent dictator. The inciting incident arrived on a particularly still Tuesday afternoon, a day so perfect it felt like a painting Eleanor might have captured. I was on my small, battered fishing boat, a relic from my grandfather's days, anchored in a shallow cove near my property line. The sun warmed my face, the air was sweet with the scent of pine and water, and the gentle tug on my line was the only demand on my attention. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see Debbie's SUV idling on the nearest patch of common lawn, its engine humming impatiently. She marched towards me, her hands on her hips, a disapproving frown etched onto her face. "Mr. Vance," she barked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "Do you have a permit for that boat?" I blinked, genuinely confused. "A permit?" I replied, pulling in my line. "I've been fishing on this lake since I was a boy. My grandfather built this house. There's never been a permit requirement for residents." She scoffed, a dismissive sound that grated on my nerves. "Things change, Mr. Vance. This is HOA water now. And we have new regulations. No motorized boats over 10 horsepower without a permit, and all fishing requires a Grandview Heights fishing license. Furthermore, she gestured vaguely at my boat, your vessel is clearly too close to the common area swimming beach. You're disturbing the peace. My boat was a 5-horsepower antique, and the closest swimming beach was a patch of weeds 100 yards away, rarely used. Madam Sterling, this is a private lake. My family has owned direct frontage for nearly a century. Nonsense, she snapped, her face reddening. The entire lake became common property when the Grandview Heights development was established. It's in the bylaws. I'm afraid you're in violation of multiple community standards. Expect a formal notice and a fine of $50 for unauthorized fishing, and another $75 for boat placement. Consider this your final warning, Mr. Vance. Comply, or face further penalties. With that, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her SUV, leaving me adrift in a suddenly less peaceful world, a chill creeping through the warm afternoon air. The audacity was breathtaking. The fine arrived 2 days later, a crisp, official-looking document with Debbie Sterling's imperious signature scrawled at the bottom. The injustice of it, the sheer, unmitigated arrogance, gnawed at me. My initial reaction was a familiar surge of anger, a ghost of the litigator I used to be. Every fiber of my being wanted to fight, to tear apart her flimsy assertions with the precision of a surgeon. But then the weariness settled in. The last thing I wanted was another battle. Eleanor was gone. My career was gone. All I craved was peace, the quiet solitude of my lake. Was $125 worth the hassle? Could I not just pay it, swallow the bitter pill, and return to my fragile peace? I sat on my porch, the fine notice clutched in my hand, watching the ripples on the lake, the internal debate raging within me. The desire for tranquility wrestled with a deep-seated revulsion for injustice, a core tenet instilled in me by my grandfather. I thought of Eleanor, her gentle eyes, her quiet strength. She had always encouraged me to stand up for what was right, to never let anyone diminish me. And I thought of my grandfather, a man who built his life on integrity. He would often say, Arthur, justice isn't given, it's taken. You have to fight for it, sometimes with every fiber of your being, especially when it's your own space, your own peace, your own legacy that's threatened. His words echoed in my mind, a rallying cry from the past. Debbie Sterling wasn't just fining me, she was trying to dictate how I lived on my own property, how I connected with the very essence of my family's history. She was attempting to erase the memory of my grandfather's foresight and Eleanor's joy. The thought solidified my resolve. No. I refused to be bullied, not by her, not by anyone, not in my home, not on my lake, not after everything I'd already lost. The peace I sought would not come from capitulation, but from a just resolution. The sleeping giant within me stirred. The transformation from grieving retiree to methodical investigator was swift, almost automatic. It was as if a switch had flipped, accessing a dormant part of my brain. My mind, long trained in the intricacies of corporate law, now focused its formidable analytical power on a new target, Deborah Sterling and the Grandview Heights HOA. I dusted off my old external hard drives, fired up my secure VPN, and accessed the labyrinthine public records databases I knew so well. My research began with the broadest strokes, encompassing the history of property ownership in the region, going back centuries, then narrowing to the specific parcel of land that encompassed the Grandview Heights development. I pulled every deed, every easement, every survey, every plat map I could find. I delved into the minutiae of the Grandview Heights Homeowners Association itself. Its founding documents, the Articles of Incorporation, the original bylaws, subsequent amendments, nothing was too obscure, no document too mundane. I cross-referenced county records, state land registries, environmental impact assessments, and even historical zoning ordinances. I remembered obscure legal precedents, recalled specific clauses from land use cases I'd studied decades ago. My network of retired legal contacts, still lingering in the digital ether, provided invaluable advice on where to look for less obvious information, whispers of old local controversies, and unique historical quirks of property law in this specific county. The process was painstaking, methodical, a digital archaeological dig for legal truth. I worked late into the nights, fueled by strong coffee and a cold, determined resolve. The lake, which had once offered only quiet reflection, now became the very crucible of my strategic planning, its calm surface mirroring the collected precision of my renewed legal mind. The revelation, when it came, felt less like a sudden lightning strike and more like the slow, inevitable dawning of a perfect sunrise. It was buried deep within the original land grant documents, dating back to the 1920s, long before the concept of an HOA even existed. My great-grandfather, a shrewd and forward-thinking man, had acquired the vast acreage that now comprised Grandview Heights. When he eventually sold off portions for development in the 1950s, a specific, irrefutable clause had been inserted into the master deed, a clause that subsequent developers and, crucially, the founders of the HOA, had either overlooked or conveniently forgotten. The clause stipulated, in clear, unambiguous legal language, that while certain common areas and roadways would be subject to a future homeowners association, the lakebed itself, along with a specified portion of the immediate shoreline encircling it, would remain irrevocably private property, held in perpetuity by the Vance family and their heirs. My grandfather had inherited it, and now, I, Arthur Vance, held the absolute, unassailable deed to Lake Serenity. The HOA waters Debbie Sterling so imperiously referenced were, in fact, my private domain. The fishing permits, the boat regulations, the fines, they were all built on a foundation of sand, on an assumption that had no basis in law. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no legal standing, no authority whatsoever over the lake. I owned it. Every glittering inch of its surface, every depth of its water, every grain of sand on its bed. It was a trump card of epic proportions, a loaded weapon waiting to be deployed. The sheer magnitude of the discovery sent a jolt of vindication through me, chasing away the lingering shadow of grief, replacing it with a cold, exhilarating sense of purpose. Debbie Sterling had no idea who she was dealing with, or what she had just provoked. The exhilaration of the discovery was quickly tempered by the need for absolute certainty. Even with decades of legal experience, I knew the importance of peer review, of having a second, equally sharp mind scrutinize my findings. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation in property law was legendary, even in his retirement. Marcus had been my mentor, my partner on countless difficult cases, and a trusted friend for over 30 years. He had a memory like an elephant and an encyclopedic knowledge of every obscure land statute known to man. "Arthur, you old hermit." Marcus boomed, his voice still as vibrant as ever. "Thought you disappeared into the wilderness with your fishing rod." "Almost did, Marcus. But something came up. Something interesting. I need your eyes on some documents." I explained the situation, omitting the specific details of my grand discovery, framing it as a challenging jurisdictional dispute. Marcus listened patiently, occasionally interjecting with a shrewd question, his legal mind already whirring. A week later, he arrived at my doorstep, a worn leather briefcase in hand. We spent 2 full days poring over the documents, spread across my dining table like an archaeological dig. I watched him closely, seeing the familiar furrow of concentration on his brow, the occasional hum of realization. Finally, he leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Arthur," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "you've done it. You haven't just found a loophole, you found the entire bloody treasure chest. This clause, it's ironclad. Absolutely watertight. Your great-grandfather was a genius. He essentially carved out the lake and its immediate environs as a sovereign entity, beyond the reach of any future common interest development. The HOA has zero, zip, nada jurisdiction. You, my friend, are the undisputed monarch of Lake Serenity." His words, confirming my own meticulous findings, were like a bomb, validating the long, solitary hours of research. Marcus then leaned forward, his voice dropping. But this isn't just about winning a legal argument, Arthur. This is about power. And you now hold all of it. How do you intend to wield it? That question had already consumed my thoughts. My strategy began to crystallize, evolving from a vague notion of defense into a precise, multi-phase plan of attack. Marcus offered invaluable strategic advice, not just on the legal angles, but on the psychological warfare inherent in dealing with someone like Debbie Sterling. Don't tip your hand too early, Arthur, he cautioned. Let her overplay hers. Let her dig her own grave. The deeper she digs, the more satisfying the fall. My plan was a classic three-act play. Act 1, subtle probing. A polite, legally ambiguous letter, just enough to make her second-guess herself, or, more likely, to inflame her arrogance. Act 2, the escalation. I would allow her to retaliate, to double down on her bullying, knowing that every move she made would only strengthen my case against her. The goal was to paint her into a corner, to expose her for the petty tyrant she was, not just to me, but to the entire community. And Act 3, the coup de grace. The public, undeniable, absolute revelation that would not only strip her of her power but utterly demolish her credibility and standing. This wasn't just about the lake anymore, it was about ensuring that no one else in Grandview Heights would ever suffer under her despotic rule again. This was a chess match, and Debbie Sterling had just blundered her queen. To execute this strategy, I needed more than just the legal trump card, I needed irrefutable evidence of Debbie's malfeasance and her bullying tactics. My meticulous nature, a trait honed over decades of litigation, kicked into high gear. I became a quiet observer, a stealthy collector of facts. First, I installed discreet, high-definition security cameras on my property, strategically positioned to capture activity around my dock and the nearby common areas. These would record any further incidents with Debbie or her enforcers, providing undeniable visual proof. Next, I quietly started talking to other residents, those who had visibly flinched at Debbie's name, or whose faces bore the weary resignation of constant harassment. I sought out Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who had been fined for her garden gnomes violating aesthetic standards. I spoke to the young family whose children were forbidden from playing soccer in their own yard because the ball occasionally rolled onto common property. Slowly, cautiously, I built a dossier of grievances. I didn't reveal my ultimate plan, just listened with a sympathetic ear, jotting down notes, dates, and specific incidents. These testimonials would form a crucial part of the public unmasking, proving a pattern of abusive behavior. My investigation also branched into the HOA's financial records. As a former corporate lawyer, I knew how to follow a money trail. I requested public records of the HOA's annual budgets, expenditures, and meeting minutes. My suspicions about Debbie's lavish lifestyle seemed to be confirmed by the vague entries, the inflated service contracts with companies I'd never heard of, the unexplained administrative fees. I cross-referenced these with her publicly available property tax records and luxury vehicle registrations. I started building a second, equally damning case, one of potential financial impropriety and abuse of power. I was assembling an arsenal, piece by painstaking piece, preparing for a war that Debbie Sterling didn't even know she had declared. My first move was deliberately subtle, a gentle prod to test her reaction. I drafted a letter, formal and polite, but steeped in carefully chosen legal language. I had Marcus's old law firm send it, lending it an air of established authority without revealing my direct involvement. The letter simply questioned the HOA's specific legal authority over Lake Serenity, politely requesting copies of any deeds, easements, or agreements that granted the association jurisdiction over the lake bed and water. It cited general principles of riparian rights and historical land ownership, hinting at complexities without exposing the core truth. It was a fishing expedition of a different kind, designed to bait the hook. Debbie Sterling, blinded by her own hubris and convinced of her unassailable authority, took the bait whole. She dismissed the letter as the nuisance of an uninformed, stubborn old man. Her retaliation was swift and, as I had predicted, disproportionately aggressive. A week after my letter, a stern, official-looking document arrived. It wasn't just another fine, it was an escalating threat. The original fines for fishing and boat placement were tripled, now totaling $375. The letter further stated that due to my continued defiance and harassment of HOA officials, my access to all common areas, the community pool, the clubhouse, even the small walking trails, would be revoked if the fines were not paid within 48 hours. It accused me of frivolous litigation and threatened to levy additional legal fees against me. Her signature, bold and self-important, seemed to sneer from the page. The line, however, was truly crossed not with a letter, but with an act of petty vandalism. One morning, I woke to find my grandfather's old fishing boat, the same one Debbie had singled out, missing from my dock. In its place was a crudely painted HOA property, "No trespassing" sign nailed directly into my antique wooden dock, ruining the aged timber. The boat was later found grounded on the far side of the lake, clearly vandalized, its small motor submerged and ruined. But the sign hammered into the very fabric of my family's legacy, was the final, unforgivable insult. This wasn't just about property or legal disputes anymore. This was a direct, personal assault on my sanctuary, a blatant disrespect for my grandfather's memory and Eleanor's peace. Any lingering desire for a peaceful resolution, any flicker of hesitation, was utterly extinguished. It was time for the gloves to come off. My rage, cold and precise, was now focused into a single, unyielding directive: total, absolute victory. The stage for the coup de grace was set for the annual HOA meeting, an event traditionally marked by Debbie's self-congratulatory speeches and the weary silence of the residents. I had quietly, through carefully placed calls and emails, let it be known that there would be new business of critical importance regarding the lake. The room, the Grandview Heights Community Clubhouse, was packed. Whispers circulated, a low hum of anticipation replacing the usual apathy. Debbie, radiant in an aggressively tailored pantsuit, strode to the podium, a smug smile plastered across her face. She launched into a lengthy, self-congratulatory monologue about her achievements, subtly hinting at difficult residents who sought to undermine community harmony. She even mentioned, with a pointed glance in my direction, recent challenges to HOA authority that have thankfully been resolved. When she finally opened the floor for new business, I raised my hand. She tried to ignore me, but the collective gaze of the room, many of whom I had quietly spoken with, forced her to acknowledge me. "Yes, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have something relevant to add, or are you here to continue your baseless claims?" "Madam President," I began, my voice calm, clear, and projected to fill the room, "I do have something relevant. In fact, I believe it concerns every single homeowner in Grandview Heights. It concerns the very foundation of this association, and more specifically, the lake." I walked to the front, carrying a slim briefcase. On the table, I laid out a projector and a laptop. "Before we proceed," I continued, "I have here a comprehensive legal brief, a series of historical documents, and an audit of the HOA's financials." Debbie scoffed. "Mr. Vance, we don't have time for your conspiracy theories. This is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom." "On the contrary, Madam President," I countered, my eyes fixed on hers, "what I'm about to present will, in fact, redefine this association's authority, and perhaps, its very existence." I clicked a button, and the first slide appeared on the screen, a detailed map of the Grandview Heights development, with a clear, bold red line outlining Lake Serenity. "For years," I stated, "this association has asserted ownership and jurisdiction over Lake Serenity, claiming it as common property. Fines have been issued, access restricted, and residents have been led to believe that this body of water falls under the purview of your bylaws." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "However," I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a zoomed-in image of the original 1950s master deed, its antique script clear and undeniable, "my research, rigorously reviewed by one of the state's foremost property law experts, has uncovered a fundamental error in that assertion. A very expensive error, it turns out." I pointed to a specific paragraph highlighted in bold on the screen. "This clause," I explained, dating back to the original land grant by my great-grandfather, explicitly and irrevocably designates the lakebed of Lake Serenity, and a significant portion of its immediate shoreline, as private property of the Vance family, and their heirs. It was never, not for a single moment, ceded to any future common interest development or homeowners association. The HOA, Madam President, has absolutely no legal jurisdiction over the lake. None whatsoever. A murmur rippled through the room. Debbie's face, which had been contorted in an angry sneer, began to pale, a sickly white. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, finding her voice. "This is a fabrication. You're trying to deceive these people." "Am I?" I said, a cool smile playing on my lips. I clicked to the next slide, a scan of the original deed, stamped and certified by the county recorder's office, followed by an official legal opinion from Marcus Thorne's firm, confirming my interpretation. "Here," I said, my voice rising slightly for emphasis, "is the certified deed. And here, a legal opinion from Thorne, Harrison, and Finch, validating its authenticity and its legal force. I also have with me a preemptive court injunction, granted this morning, against any further interference by the HOA with my private property, specifically Lake Serenity." I held up a stamped court document. The room erupted. People were whispering, pointing, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning realization. Debbie's eyes darted around, searching for support, finding only confusion and growing anger. She tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "And that," I said, my voice gaining a chilling edge, "is only half the story." I transitioned to the next set of slides, detailed spreadsheets, invoices, and bank statements. For years, the HOA has collected substantial fees from residents, ostensibly for the maintenance of common areas, including, as we now know, the lake. I pointed to several highlighted entries. These are invoices for lake maintenance services totaling over $100,000 annually. Yet, these services were never rendered. The companies listed are shell corporations. The funds, I stated, clicking to a final slide that showed transfers to an offshore account, were systematically diverted. Diversions that, when cross-referenced with your personal financial statements, Madam President, appear to align perfectly with your recent acquisition of a new luxury vehicle, an expansion of your vacation home in the Hamptons, and an astonishing amount of high-end shopping. I had the proof, laid bare for all to see, the financial audit, complete with bank records and a trail of her personal expenses that aligned suspiciously well with the missing HOA funds. The revelation was a punch to the gut of the community. Gasps filled the room. Debbie's face was no longer pale, it was an angry, mottled red. "This is slander. You have no proof," she screeched, but her voice was cracking. "I have all the proof, Madam President," I said, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "And I have submitted it to the county prosecutor's office, along with my full findings regarding your lack of jurisdiction over the lake. You've not only been acting beyond your legal authority, but you've also been operating what appears to be a sophisticated embezzlement scheme." The room became a maelstrom of shouted accusations and furious demands for answers. Debbie's authority, which she had so assiduously cultivated, crumbled like dust in the wind. She tried to bluster, to shout over the din, to regain control, but it was futile. Residents, long silenced by her oppressive rule, now found their voices, their long-simmering resentment boiling over. One by one, they stood up, recounting their own stories of arbitrary fines, of petty dictates, of being bullied into submission. Her attempts to appeal to a false authority were met with ridicule. Her reign was over. The crown had not merely been taken, it had been melted down and exposed as cheap tin. The downfall of Deborah Sterling was swift and absolute, a spectacular public implosion. The next day, the county prosecutor's office announced a formal investigation into the Grandview Heights HOA's finances, specifically targeting the now infamous lake maintenance contracts. The local news picked up the story, reveling in the scandal of the tyrannical HOA president brought low by a quiet, unassuming resident. The headline of the local paper screamed, "Lake ownership bombshell topples HOA queen." The shame was profound, undeniable, and broadcast for all to see. Debbie, unable to weather the storm of public humiliation and legal scrutiny, resigned from the HOA board within 48 hours, her resignation letter terse and devoid of apology. The other board members, terrified of being implicated, quickly distanced themselves, some even offering to cooperate with the investigation. The legal and financial ruin that followed was comprehensive. The prosecutor's investigation uncovered a clear pattern of embezzlement and fraud, leading to criminal charges. Forced to liquidate assets to pay mounting legal fees and restitution, she put her ostentatious house on the market, then sold it at a significant loss. I saw her luxury SUV, packed to the brim, pulling out of Grandview Heights for the last time a few weeks later, her face a mask of bitter defeat. She left as a pariah, stripped of her ill-gotten gains, her power, and her reputation. With Debbie Sterling gone, and the HOA board in disarray, I found myself in a position of unexpected, almost absolute power regarding Lake Serenity. But I had no desire to become the next tyrant. My goal was justice, not control. I convened a new community meeting, this time with a very different tone. I explained my intention, to retain the legal ownership of the lake, ensuring that no future HOA could ever make false claims or impose arbitrary rules again. However, I proposed a new system, one built on fairness and shared responsibility. This lake, I announced to the now eager residents, is a gift, a resource we should all cherish. It belongs to the spirit of this community, even if the deed belongs to me. I proposed the formation of the Lake Serenity Conservation Trust, a non-profit organization that would manage the lake's resources, ensure environmental protection, and establish equitable access for all residents. The trust would be governed by a board of elected residents, with clear, transparent bylaws that I would help draft, ensuring every voice was heard and every rule was just. It would be funded by voluntary contributions, and any resident who wished to fish or use a non-motorized boat would simply register with the trust, without charge, and adhere to a few common-sense safety and conservation guidelines. The community embraced the idea with enthusiasm. A new HOA board was quickly elected, composed of respected, ethical residents who had suffered under Debbie's rule. They committed to transparency, fiscal responsibility, and a true spirit of community cooperation. The lake, once a point of contention and control, became a symbol of unity and shared stewardship. Children swam freely. Fishermen cast their lines without fear of fines. The sound of laughter echoed across the water, replacing the oppressive silence that Debbie's rule had imposed. Grandview Heights was demonstrably better off, a true community restored to itself, thanks to the quiet perseverance of one unassuming man. Months later, the scars of the battle had faded, replaced by the gentle rhythm of a community at peace. I often found myself on my dock, fishing, just as I had always done, but now without the lurking dread of a self-appointed despot appearing. The lake, my sanctuary, had truly returned to being a place of healing. The tranquility was no longer fragile, it was robust, protected by the very truth I had uncovered. The quiet lapping of the water against the shore was a soothing balm, an echo of the peace I had finally found. I had one last thing to do. Near my dock, in a small, sheltered cove where Eleanor used to sit and paint, I had a simple, elegant stone bench installed. On its backrest, a bronze plaque was affixed. It read, "Eleanor's Cove, for the love of beauty, the strength of spirit, and the enduring tranquility of Lake Serenity." Below it, in smaller script, was a dedication to my grandfather, Elias Vance, whose foresight had preserved this natural treasure. I looked at the plaque, then out at the shimmering surface of the lake. It wasn't just my legacy I had protected, it was theirs. I felt their presence, a profound sense of rightness settling over me. The lesson, etched into the very fabric of Grandview Heights, was clear: bullies, driven by their own boundless hubris, inevitably overplay their hand. They mistake bluster for power, and ignorance for authority. True power, I had learned, wasn't about titles or wealth or the ability to intimidate. It was quiet. It resided in knowledge, in meticulous preparation, in the unwavering conviction that justice, no matter how deeply buried, can always be unearthed. And sometimes, the most unassuming person, pushed to their limit, will reveal a hidden strength that can shatter an empire. All it takes is the courage to stand up, and the resolve to see it through, because the quiet ones, those who cherish their peace, are often the most formidable when provoked. The story of Deborah Sterling and Lake Serenity is a testament to that truth. If you've ever had to deal with a power-hungry HOA or a community bully, let me know in the comments what you would have done. Your experiences are important, and standing up for yourself can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories of justice served and bullies getting their comeuppance. I've got a lot more tales where this one came from, and trust me, they're just as satisfying.